When countries trade, women win. Companies that export employ more women, pay them more, and offer higher skilled opportunities than those that do not. Trade is helping women reinvent their traditional roles thanks to global value chains, the digital economy, and modern services. But trade alone cannot change the fact that women are underpaid and underemployed compared to men. Despite progress, the deck is still stacked in favor of men. In many countries, laws, policies, and traditions are weighing women down. These factors unfairly impact where women work, how much women earn, and what they can afford to buy. Sudden, unexpected crises such as COVID-19 can further expose the economic fragility women face. How can countries support women and help them to participate more in the global economy? Serious changes are needed. Data is essential to understand how trade impacts men and women differently. Countries need to reduce barriers to trade, end gender-based discrimination, and increase investment in services for women. We need to rethink a woman's work and promote a more equitable future that benefits everyone.
Good afternoon and good evening. I'm Carolyn Freund, the Global Director for Trade, Investment, and Competitiveness, here to welcome you to today's exciting event on the role of trade in promoting women's equality. This event is here to launch joint work between the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, and that report will become live at 9 o'clock. Launching our event today, we have Mari Panestu and Roberto Acevedo. Mari Panestu is the Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank, and we'll start with you. Mari, the floor is yours. Good. That's the most common phrase on TV.
Thank you for the opportunity to open this important discussion and the launch of the new report. I guess it's 9 a.m., so it is launched. Women and Trade, the role of trade in promoting women's equality, which is the result of the close cooperation between the World Bank and the WTO. Before beginning, I want to recognize my good friend, Roberto Acevedo, who throughout his career, but especially as the DG of the WTO, he has shown his leadership on trade as a tool for inclusion. The discussion here today is a testament to his commitment to the issue, and all of us at the World Bank wish him the very best. The World Bank Group takes as its starting point that no country, community, or economy can achieve its potential or meet the challenges of the 21st century without the full and equal participation of women and men, girls and boys. In the last 2 decades, we have seen the narrowing of the gender divide between men and women, particularly in primary education. Yet critical gaps remain, we know that. The World Bank Group is working on many parallel paths towards strengthening existing knowledge on the relationship between trade and gender, as well as more practically assisting developing countries in their efforts to support women involved in international trade, whether as workers in the export-oriented firms or being part of the supply chain, or women-owned businesses and entrepreneurs. A critical component of our work is collecting and analyzing data from a gender perspective. We know the famous saying, right? What does not get measured does not get done. We have often lacked relevant sex disaggregated data. For example, critical labor market analysis that informs trade policy reforms rarely indicates how the impact of women and men may be different. There is therefore a great need for data with gender perspective to help us understand how trade and gender equality are linked and whether men and women are disproportionately affected, positively or negatively, by trade policies and their implementation. In turn, we hope this will lead to better policies that take into account the differential impact between men and women. The research presented here today goes a long way to fill these data gaps. I'm really, really happy with the launch of this report. And the results are really impressive. First, countries that are open to international trade tend to grow faster, innovate, improve productivity, and provide higher income and more opportunities to their people, and therefore reducing poverty. I think these are findings that we have known for some time, but it's good to be reconfirmed. And in addition, the finding now is that countries that are more open to trade, as measured by the trade to GDP ratio, have higher levels of gender equality. Second, trade has the potential to dramatically expand women's role in the economy, decrease inequality, and expand women's access to skills and education. Trade increases women's wages and creates better jobs for women. Women's share of total wages increases because exporting firms both pay better wages and also increase the demand for labor. The higher income for women has a positive impact also on other development gains through what they use the money for. For example, in Africa, the new World Bank analysis shows that freer trade would help close the wage gap, especially for skilled women workers. Models on the implementation of CFTA suggest that by 2035, women's wages would rise faster than men. A few days ago, we launched a report to show the potential gains and their distribution. The expected increase in wages translates roughly to an extra 2 weeks' pay each year, enough for a woman's earning of US $5 a day to pay for one family's members' personal supplies, school supplies, and uniform for an entire school year. Fourth, exporters employ more women. In developing countries, women make up 33% of the workforce of export firms, compared with just 24% of non-exporting firms. An example is, of course, the garment sector, such as in Bangladesh, which shows how trade has transformed the lives of women over the past 30 years. The sector has expanded on average by 17% per year since 1980 and represents over 3/4 of Bangladesh's export earnings. And the reason the garment sector has been so transformational is that it offered formal job opportunities to women outside their homes for the first time, directly increasing women's incomes and labor force participation. The sector now employs 4 million workers. An estimated 90% of them are women, a 100-fold increase in workers within just 3 decades. Trade can also create incentives for countries to expand women's legal rights and their access to crucial resources, such as education and technology. Improved women's rights have also promoted more trade. This has led to a virtuous cycle between increased trade and gender equality. High levels of gender equality are linked to higher levels of diversification and making countries less vulnerable to international shocks. But today we have the impact of the global pandemic, and the gains from trade to women are at risk. Although this research was done before the global pandemic, its conclusions are more relevant than ever. Take, for example, the garments example that we just mentioned. Lockdown measures have led to a large number of order cancellations and many factory shutdowns in countries such as Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And women hold a disproportionate number of jobs in the clothing sector and make the majority of clothing purchases as family members. Furthermore, there are also the shutdown of tourism sectors, which also disproportionately affect women. So gaining a better understanding of how women are affected by trade will be essential as countries develop and the global economy recovers from the pandemic. I hope the discussion today can help policymakers identify the potential opportunities that trade can provide for women and businesses and buttress support for a more inclusive rules-based trading system. So for instance, in the relief programs that we are all rolling out in various countries, and the World Bank is also providing technical advice, direct assistance to jobs in sectors which are disproportionately employing women, including the wage subsidies that are being given, financial assistance and digital training to women-owned businesses, and so on. We need to pay attention to the differential impact. Preliminary results of our surveys of firms during the crisis also show some relatively good result, that 20% of firms, despite all the downsizing and all that, 20% of firms are adopting digital in their business. And therefore, we need to ensure that women and women-owned businesses can also transition to the new way of work and business model that will involve the use of digital technology. Needless to say, keeping trade going is an important prerequisite to all that we have just talked about. That is the importance of keeping an open and rules-based multilateral trading system, which remains priority, and also ensuring continued development of robust global value chains. And I would say the potential role of the trade in services sector in the future, which will, I do think, also benefit women. The World Bank Group is committed to push forward its engagements on trade and gender. Our work ranges from global and country-specific analytical work, technical assistance, and capacity building. It aims at strengthening the existing knowledge on the links between trade and gender equality to more practically assist developing countries in their efforts to support women involved in trade and to ensure that women gain from trade. The World Bank Group is also integrating gender into a variety of operational trade-related projects, such as supporting small-scale female traders in East and West Africa, increasing trade finance to women-owned SMEs, and supporting women networks in Pakistan. With that, I hand it over to Roberto, who will discuss the trends and policies that I hope can give us room for optimism on our agenda. Over to you, Roberto. Maybe over to you, Caroline. Back to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Mari, for those inspiring remarks. And as you said, next we'll turn to Roberto Acevedo, who's Director General of the WTO. Roberto, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Mari, for your kind words. And hello, everyone. It's nice to see you, Mari. We've been together in so many trade discussions and discussing important things. This is one of the most important topics I think that we have before us with trade. So I'm happy that we're together on this one. Well, good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever you are. I'm very pleased today to launch this joint World Bank WTO report on women and trade. Once again, our organizations join hands to provide analysis and policy recommendations on how to make trade more inclusive. You know, this report adds actually to previous joint World Bank WTO publications. The last one looked at how trade can reduce poverty. Now we are placing a special focus on trade and gender equality. And let me start by thanking everyone in both organizations who contributed to this excellent report. On our side, special thanks goes to Roberta Piermantini and José Antonio Monteiro, who coordinated the production of the report. And I invite you all to read it. The report is full of insights and examples about the connections between trade and the economic empowerment of women. And for me, and trying to look at the whole of the report and picking up on important issues, for me, there were three main takeaways. The first one is that there is, in fact, robust evidence on how trade offers tremendous opportunities to women. And the facts are quite clear. So trade creates more, better paid, and better quality jobs for women. The second takeaway is that going forward, women need to be in a position to take advantage of the three major trends in global trade. There are many, but these three are fundamental. So the first one is the rise in services. The second one is the spread of global value chains. And the third is the expansion of the digital economy. And in my view, a lot of work needs to be done in this regard of preparing women to seize these opportunities. And the third takeaway is precisely a complement to this one, is that to make the most of these opportunities, we need to act, and we need to act now. The fact is that many women continue to face higher barriers, that can exclude them from the opportunities that are presented by the 21st century trade. And there are opportunities out there. Let me give you some example. I think women need improved access to financial resources. They need improved access to IT technologies and to digital skills. And let's not forget other structural challenges, such as the fact that tariffs are significantly higher on industries where women have the most to gain. Clearly, that's the case of apparel and textiles. And the report, frankly, couldn't be timelier. The COVID-19 pandemic has provoked the deepest economic recession of our lifetimes. In recent WTO analysis shows that women risk losing some really hard-won progress towards greater gender equality because of this crisis. And for example, some sectors that disproportionately employ women, and Mari mentioned some of them, but clearly textiles, apparel, travel, tourism, hospitality. Now, these are the very sectors that experienced some of the largest falls in export growth during the first months of the pandemic. So looking forward, I have no doubt we need to lay the foundations for a strong, sustainable, and inclusive economic recovery. And inclusive here is the key word. And to build back better, we need to ensure that women are able to benefit from trade. Now, the WTO has an important role to play in this. Ongoing WTO negotiations have the potential to remove many of the obstacles faced by women in the world economy. The 2017 Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment was endorsed by 126 WTO members and observers. So we need to build on this momentum. Women's economic empowerment is not only a moral imperative, it's also the smart economic move. It's in the interests of each and every one of us. So I do hope that you'll have a productive discussion today. This is a conversation that needs to advance as quickly as the world is changing. So thank you again for the invitation and the opportunity. I wish you all a great day of work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Roberto and Mari, for setting the stage for this discussion, highlighting the role of women as workers and also as consumers, and also for pointing out how both institutions can contribute to the contribution of women in trade. I'd like to now turn to two of the lead authors of the report, Roberta Piermartini from the WTO and Nadia Rocha from the World Bank, to present the report. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. Well, so before I start, we would like to thank all of the contributors to this report, without whom this important piece of research would not have been possible. So why did we produce this report? We wanted to create a dedicated study that went beyond the vague platitudes linking trade and women. We wanted to produce a study backed by data that, instead of having people roll their eyes when we talk about trade and gender, that they open their eyes to the opportunities that trade can bring to women. What we have created is a study that provides evidence-based facts and recommendations on how to improve women's well-being through trade. Of course, through this process, we faced many challenges. The most difficult to overcome was the lack of data, specifically the absence of detailed data on the occupations that women have and the sectors where they work. One would generally think that this information is easy to find and readily available. Our team worked hard to collect sex-disaggregated data at the industry and occupation level across different countries. This is, however, not a one-off exercise, and we hope that collection of this information becomes the common practice across countries. Another challenge was related to understanding and articulating the complexity of the linkages between trade and women. In the report, we created a framework to single out all the different channels through which trade affects women as workers, both at home and at work, as consumers, and also as decision makers. Now, let me just take you to the main findings of the report. The most surprising result is that firms that engage in international trade employ more women and pay them more. In developing countries, women make up 33% of the workforce of firms that trade internationally, compared with just 24% of non-exporting firms. In countries such as Morocco, Romania, and Vietnam, women represent more than half of the workforce of exporting firms. These firms have created jobs for more than 5 million women in these countries, roughly 15% of the working female population. But why is that? What makes firms that are engaged in trade different in terms of the employment opportunities that they provide to women? The results we found are not driven by sectors such as apparel, where a lot of women are currently employed, suggesting that there are other factors that deserve further analysis. Maybe exporting firms use technologies that are more complementary to us women, or they are simply more open to gender diversity, as they are more exposed to different markets and cultures. Trade also increases women's wages and increases economic equality. Globally, women take home a smaller share of wages. But our analysis suggests that if developing countries would double their manufacturing exports, women's shares of wages could increase almost 6 percentage points through a combination of increased employment and also higher salaries. And beyond wages, women working in exporting firms are more likely to be employed formally, giving them opportunities for benefits, training, and job security. The potential impact of trade on women consumers is also striking. We know that female-headed households, especially in developing countries, they tend to spend a larger share of their income on agricultural goods, mainly food. These goods are usually subject to higher tariffs. Our analysis shows that eliminating import tariffs could result in 2.5% more real income for female-headed households compared to male-headed households. To put this in perspective, in countries such as Burkina Faso or Cameroon, this would mean a gain of women equivalent to 1 year of expenditure in education or health. Beyond consumption, trade has increased female bargaining power, allowing women to delay marriage and increase investments in education. In Bangladesh, for instance, young women in villages that have been exposed to the export-intensive garment sector have delayed marriage and childbirth, and young girls have gained an additional 1.5 years of schooling. Although we have all of this evidence on the positive impact of trade on women, I am not saying that trade itself is good for all women, and therefore is the only solution to gender inequality. Localized costs related with trade liberalization can negatively affect women's livelihoods. Let's remember that 80% of women globally still hold low to medium skilled jobs and can be particularly vulnerable to shocks such as the current COVID-19 pandemic. Roberta will now highlight how this research will be used to design gender-inclusive policies that ensure that the vulnerable are not left behind. Roberta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadia. So, as Nadia just laid down, when women trade, women gain. Then the question is, what can policymakers do to make women participate more in trade? Let me start with one issue, the pink tariff. What do we mean by pink tariff? This is not to say that tariffs are different for men and for women, but that because of what women consume and because of the sectors in which women work, women end up paying more for their goods. For example, high tariffs in agriculture and textile, where many women work, not only mean, as Nadia has already said, that women as consumers pay more, it also means that women as producers pay more for their inputs and pay more when they want to export for their exports. For India, we estimated the pink tariff, the gap between what women pay and what men pay in exporting, of about 6 percentage points. Although the gap is lower in developed countries, we also found a pink tariff for the United States and for Germany. Then, what can policymakers do to increase women participation in trade? Remove the pink tariff. And in general, reduce barriers that in sectors where women work. So this includes also addressing barriers in the services sector, ease access to international market for small and medium enterprises, because women who own a business typically own a small business. And in the report, we also stress the importance of a rapid implementation of the trade facilitation agreements of the WTO as a way to reduce the risks that women face at the border. But trade policy alone cannot close the gender gap. A lot more needs to be done to address legal and social cultural barriers, to improve access to finance, to education, technology. And also, we should not forget that women are often the most vulnerable in a society. Then, because of trade, technological changes, and as we've seen, discussed in the pandemic, women can lose their jobs. And because of their situation, they find it difficult to find another job or cope with a period of unemployment. We need, therefore, well-designed adjustment policies to make sure that no one is left behind. So going forward, what more can trade do? We identify in the report 3 global trends that can bring new opportunities to women. Services, where most women work, are increasingly important in the global economy, and they are likely to generate new jobs, opportunities for women. Countries increasingly integrating global value chains which create more and better jobs for women. And then digital technologies. They help women to bypass some of their traditional constraints, such as access to finance through mobile banking, and also help them to balance the work and household responsibility. It is not by chance that women-owned companies are relatively more present online than offline. Recently, what we have seen is that in response to the pandemic, governments have increased and accelerated their investment in the digital technologies. This report points out that this can be an opportunity for further integrating women into trade. And this, if there is a collective effort. What do we mean? What we mean is that everybody has a part to play. Governments by investing in infrastructure, women IT skill development, firms by providing for flexible labor arrangements, international organizations providing research, developing routes on digital trade, for example. Are these collective efforts on the right path? Then, well, what we see is that there is increasing awareness that women and trade are connected. Government, civil society, business, international organizations are including gender issues in their trade agenda, in their agendas. And relevant discussions are taking place at the WTO, as the DG Azevedo highlighted, on services, agriculture, e-commerce, small and medium enterprises. In this report, we have mapped some of the concrete actions the countries have taken. We also provide a database on preferential trade provisions, on gender provision in preferential trade agreements. So overall, the report gives a clear picture on how trade can help to reduce gender equality. And we hope that this will be useful for policymakers to design policies. We need to keep working on data collections, on impact evaluations of these policies, and we are committed to do so. Thank you.
Very much, Nadia and Roberta, for the informative presentation. I'd really like to highlight the point that they made about the data, because that is something really new that came out of this report. If we don't know the sectors where women work in different countries, and we don't know the types of products they consume, we wouldn't know how women are affected. But this is the data that they gathered, it shows these big gains from the production side. It shows the products that women buy are often taxed at higher rates than the products that men buy. So these are things that we can adjust with policy. The gains from trade that women have experienced are also in extreme danger with this pandemic, both as trade slows and also as women have to stay home, often because of their extensive burden with childcare. So these are some of the things that we can discuss today. I'd now like to take the opportunity to introduce our panel. We have an exciting group, all with extensive careers in international trade, and they cut across the private sector, the public sector, as well as experience in academia. So we have Dr. Rubana Hook. She's the first female, and I'll look forward to the day when we don't say that anymore, but the first female president of the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers and Exporters Association, as well as the managing director of Mohammadi Group, a garment exporting firm that has recently diversified into other businesses. She's also a published poet and a PhD in English literature. We also have Ms. Laura Lane, who actually broke a glass ceiling, I think just yesterday or the day before, who had formerly been president of Global Public Affairs for UPS and now is Chief Corporate Affairs and Communications Officer. Ms. Lane has also held senior positions in government, including at the United States Trade Representative and the U.S. Foreign Service. Finally, we have Dr. Stephen Karingy. He is the director of the Regional Integration and Trade Division at United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, also known as UNECA. Dr. Karingy has an extensive publication record, and before joining UNECA, he worked in a public policy think tank and as a lecturer at Egerton University. And I understand he's had some problems connecting and may be joining us by audio. So I'm going to start with a question to all speakers. And why don't we start with Rubana? What do you consider the most important advances made for women in the international trading environment since you started in the field? Rubana, over to you.
I'm really not sure about the question, because here I am sitting actually not only talking about women in the business, but also women as workers who contribute. So I kind of wear different hats. So it's very difficult for me to separate any of that from one another. I can only tell you that number one, if we refer back to the report and the findings, the classic case was, we heard the MD of World Bank saying that, keep trade going. Well, we have to just keep women going. Because even in Bangladesh, where there are more than 70% women engaged in the ready-made garment sector, there are very few entrepreneurs who are female. So you literally can count the few numbers of female entrepreneurs that we have in this country. So it's also about access to finance, which incredibly is a barrier, along with the mindset that people have about women leading or even women working. So there are lots of barriers which spring up on a daily basis. The women who work in ready-made garment sector at this point of time have been absolutely vulnerable to, of course, COVID. And very unfortunately, all these women support just not themselves, but their entire family. So the fabric of their existence all depends on ready-made garments. So those of us who are leading and linking our trade to international buyers and to the West, along with these women, have actually become very, very helpless at this point of time. So the shock has taken us to a new reality where all these women wouldn't know what to do without working in a ready-made garment sector, because there's a question of education. So the qualification is key. Now we're literally not very sure about what their next skill set should be. So it's a question of retooling ourselves, reinventing ourselves. And you know, it's a worthy investment to be made in women, because we do lead and we do sustain and we do provide. So women of Bangladesh and other manufacturing countries have a different responsibility altogether. It's just not about earning our own livelihoods. It's about basically nurturing a whole society to the next level and bringing it to the next level. And I'm very happy to announce that, you know, now ready-made garment workers from our country are actually attending university as well, an international university education. So that's a great breakthrough for us. So I look forward to that day when women, especially underprivileged women, have access to the next skill set and to higher education and to a new beginning, because beyond the sewing lines of where they work on a day-to-day basis, they have limited dreams. And we, as entrepreneurs or people who are in responsible position, have a responsibility to support these women. So for me, it's always a hashtag she for she, and rarely hashtag he for she, because it is about women supporting women. It is about entrepreneurs supporting entrepreneurs. It's about female entrepreneurs, female executives actually leading the way and beating all the odds and literally escaping all the, especially the South Asian mindsets and the hiccups that we have in getting where we are today.
Much. That's a really interesting point you made about workers versus entrepreneurs. And along with this work, and also highlighted in the recent World Development Report on Global Value Chains, one of the things we looked at is within global value chains, women tend to be well represented as workers. So they actually do better in global value chain firms that are participating in importing and exporting than in other firms, so as workers. But as entrepreneurs, they do less well than in other firms. So they haven't been able to break that glass ceiling in terms of either leading those firms as managers or owning those firms. So exactly what you said. So very interesting point. Thank you. Laura, so you've had an extensive experience in trade as well. What have you seen change over these years, and what advances have you seen in terms of women's participation?
Thank you, Caroline. And I want to say I'm just thrilled to be here. I think this report is so important and timely. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say welcome to Mari to Washington, D.C. We're really excited about her new role at the World Bank as the managing director. And to a dear friend, Director General Acevedo, I have to tell you, thank you for your service. It just seems so appropriate that this is one of your last events together with us on this topic. You have been a true he for she champion, and we were so lucky to have you heading up the WTO. But Caroline, as you said, I've spent much of my career working on international trade as a diplomat in the Foreign Service and then at USTR. And then I transitioned to the private sector. And throughout my career, a key focus of my government relations work has always been on trade policy that enabled our customers to benefit from our services across borders, be it entertainment services at Time Warner, financial services with Citigroup, or logistics services now with UPS. And because of this exposure to the international trade arena throughout my career, I'd say the biggest advances for women fold. And first and foremost, I think the establishment of the WTO in 1995 was really consequential. I'm a really big believer in transparent and predictable trade frameworks that provide that expanded market access and competition for companies that are big and small. And the WTO's role in bringing economies to the table to really harmonize and regulate international trade has been an essential factor in ensuring that women traders, especially those in developed and less developing countries, had a more level playing field when it came to moving their products across borders. And I see one of the biggest multilateral milestones being the Trade Facilitation Agreement, because it essentially made customs clearance easier and more predictable for traders And that's been powerful for small businesses, especially women-owned ones who don't always have all the resources and often face more challenges at borders just by virtue of being women. And you all mentioned it, the 2017 Buenos Aires Joint Declaration on Women Trade. What a great start that was, because it specifically addressed ways for countries to work together to ensure that half of the world's population is supported in their efforts to reach customers across borders. The second biggest development I'd say that has benefited women, though, is the advent and proliferation of digitally enabled trade. I think that's been one of the greatest equalizers, because when trade transactions are done online, it really doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman running the business, because all the customer sees is that screen and that great product. So with border processes being increasingly digitized and automated, many of the barriers that we saw in the past that prevented small businesses and women traders from exporting their goods have slowly been minimized and harmonized. And I think that development has been especially pointed considering the move to e-commerce that we've seen as entrepreneurs had to shut down some of their storefronts and go online because of COVID-19. So those, I think, are the two most powerful factors that have allowed a lot of progress to be made for women. But that's got to be the floor. We still have such a long way to go. And I'm really happy to be able to talk about some of those specifics and how our company, UPS, is helping close that gender gap in trade. And your report from the World Bank in partnership with the WTO is just so powerful for helping us make that case. So back to you, Caroline.
Much, and really excellent points about you need both policy and then also the way technology affects people's ability to trade. Stephen, coming from the Africa perspective, how do you see women's participation in trade, and what advances have they made, and what has been important over the past years? Over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for those who are in the afternoon. I hope you can hear me clearly, because I had challenges with power outage, and so I've changed the gadget that I'm using for this. So if I'm clear, I'll proceed. So you have asked for the time I've been working in the field of international trade. I recall very clearly when I started working on international trade, the main issue that we had, at least we were discussing here in Africa, was the whole idea of mainstreaming trade in national development. In other words, trade, the issue of trade liberalization, trade openness, the question of globalization was still an issue that was under much debate within the continent. And consistent efficient development, that is, let's say 20 years ago, and something needed to be done. The debate then was, how do you then ensure then that when a Minister for Finance is preparing his or her budget, he mainstreams trade in that budget so that at least trade can play the role it's supposed to play in the development of our economies. Now, fast forward, it is very exciting that today we are discussing this topic, because before we used to talk about trade mainstreaming, but now we have realized that even after we agreed that trade is good for development, and we agreed that we needed to invest in making trade work for development, not everybody benefits or participates in the kind of economies that trade openness brings. So for me, the fact that we are having this conversation about women and trade, for me, is a major advancement, because it's going to influence the way policies are designed to ensure that women are able to participate in those sectors where they have secure and vulnerable jobs, and also they can also benefit from the gains of trade, because the sectors that grow when we do open our economies are also beneficial to them. So for me, the fact that we have moved from just the debate of trade mainstreaming and financing that process to realizing that we need to realize that it's not gender neutral, that for me is a major advancement. And I'm happy to talk about how we see things now being carried along in our African Continental Free Trade Area.
And it's really true that trade provides better jobs, and in many cases more secure jobs as well. And certainly the evidence is these higher paying jobs. So that's where moving more people, and more women in particular, into these trading sector jobs can really help provide for longer term income. Rubana, I'd like to go back to you and think about Bangladesh, especially in the context of the pandemic and going forward, where one thing we've seen is this real cutback on trade, and in particular, the apparel sector has been very, very affected. In some cases, we know that that clothing was produced, it was ready to go, it was at the port, and orders were being canceled and they hadn't been paid for, and workers started to lose jobs and so forth. And many of these are women. So what can we do to support women going forward, both over the medium term, but also in this short run, where especially in a country like Bangladesh, that sector has been so important in lifting women. There are studies that show that the women who work in apparel send their kids to school more than other women. They are able to feed their families better and so forth. So what can we do now, both in the context of the pandemic and going forward? Over.
Thank you, Caroline. I think what's going to happen is, since there is going to be a downward trend in world consumption anyway, so people are going to be buying less, and people are going to be buying what they want to buy. Our priorities are going to be totally different, even as consumers. So a lot of what we do in Bangladesh and how we earn depends on the Western consumer choices. So if there's anything that needs to be done, it's basically raising the awareness about the story of women who produce apparel for the Western market. So you see, people need to humanize this trade. And when we talk about sustainability and we talk about responsible consumption, let us also not forget that there is now a very, very thin line between consumer choices, just considering environment element only, and also by supporting these lives who basically, without producing one piece of cloth, would be eating one less meal a day. So we need to have that discourse woven very intelligently and with a lot of heart and with a lot of compassion. So when we have these women in Bangladesh who depend on Western consumer choices, we need to reinvent and think, how is it that consumers are going to pay a little more because there is a story of lives and livelihoods behind all of this. So I think what we need to do is actually brand women globally, those who are engaged in production and manufacturing, because without this level of bare minimum pay that they get, considering what actually the Westerners pay for their clothes. So buy one, get one free cannot be the next slogan going forward. It has to be about responsible consumption. It has to be about humanizing the entire apparel production globally. So better stories need to be told. And also, I think in the longer run, while we look at a lot of digitization of production also, and automation of production processes also, these women will gradually lose their jobs. And when they do, it will be something that they won't be ready for, because so many women will not be prepared overnight to become coders. So we need to give them education. So what is it? How can we reskill them, retool them with education, and also push them forward so that the country should probably now also become an inward-looking economy, supporting ourselves, and maybe small businesses need to be encouraged for these women. So we must create the next level for these women, where maybe light engineering is going to be our next niche. So we need to understand the diverse sectors that we are going into later on. But for now, for the next 5 to 10 years, how do we maintain this level of employment in Bangladesh and still make them go to the next level? One thing that I can also say is that even as a mother of 3, for me, what's more important than my children's education and their health. So I think we need to be a little more cautious and sensitive about these women workers' families, so their children's education. So while we have just creches in our factories, and we need to have maybe schools, and this is something that I'd like to promote and really spread the message on, because it's done us a lot of good. We have 3 schools in the company, and that creates another level of loyalty for these women workers. So we need to be a little more mindful about these women. And while you talk about digital literacy, these women are actually, they have smartphones, most of them. So we are now starting with e-wallet concept, so that the phone just doesn't become something that they can receive wages through, but they can transfer money, they can buy things with it. It has to become their life. So we need them to be paperless. So digital literacy, digital awareness, education, branding them, turning them into small, probably business people. Lots of transitions need to be made, and a lot of careful planning needs to happen overnight, actually.
To actually turn to Stephen to take sort of the same question from the Africa perspective. And similarly, in many countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, others, there's involvement in global value chains and in garments in particular. But there's another aspect of women traders, which is those that cross borders every day to trade, these small scale traders trading food items and other light manufacturers. So how do you see how they're being affected in the pandemic, what we can do, and then more broadly in the long term going forward? And if you want, it would also be great to bring in the context of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is, of course, was supposed to be implemented this year, but has been slowed down a bit by COVID. Stephen, over to you.
No, thank you very much. So first of all, let me say that COVID has taught us a lot of things, at least here in the continent. One of the things that we have learned is that we cannot continue being out of the supply chains. And even as we get involved in the supply chain, be they regional and global, we need to have rules that make it possible for you, even if you have low income, to be able to secure for your populations the much needed emergency supplies, especially like we need for COVID. So that's one of the lessons that we have learned, because you cannot keep businesses going if you're not able to save people's lives. But coming specifically to the question that you have asked, so governments have basically responded by closing borders. So most of the border crossings within the continent were closed because every effort was being made to make sure that there is no transmission. But we also know a lot of cross-border trade happens within the continent, not necessarily through air, but also because of traders that use both formal and informal crossings to be able to conduct their trade. And a lot of those informal cross-border traders and even formal cross-border traders happen to be women. And they also trade in quantities or value of goods that are sometimes $1,000 or below. So one of the lessons we have learned out of this is that it is important for us to pursue this agenda that we have seen in some of our regional economic communities, especially COMESA, of having a simplified trade regime that makes it possible for traders not to try to avoid the formal border crossings because they are fearing of being taxed. Because what has happened today is that because we do not have a simplified trade regime, then within this pandemic, people are being forced to use informal channels to cross borders where actions are not being taken, at least to make sure that the health of those traders is taken care of. The same way, even when it comes to our truckers, because of the difficulties of crossing borders, you find that they are also being impacted in the way they move across the border. And these are the people who also carry the goods that the women, these women traders go with. So there is some statistics that we have seen whereby because of these border closures, 1% of those who have responded, who do this cross-border trading within the continent, say that they have seen their incomes coming down. And that is why this agenda of digitalization becomes very important. So for the AFCFTA, we are arguing, rather than having electronic commerce as phase 3 of the AFCFTA negotiations, let us front-load it so that as we negotiate the phase 2, the e-commerce is part and parcel of that. And lastly, one of the things that I would also want to highlight is that the studies show that in business networks, women are not as much engaged, or they do not have as deep business networks like men have. And when you do not have deep business networks, it means that it is difficult for you to be able to access the logistic services, the business network of logistic services, or even the finance networks when it comes to the financing of your businesses. So what we are trying to do here at the ECA is we are working on something called the African Women Leadership Fund. And the whole idea of this African Women Leadership Fund is to be able to provide resources and funds for women to grow their businesses, so that when these businesses grow, they do not, they can be able to expand them without having to sell them to men, or even including men into their boats, so that women can, because women are the ones who are able to know what are the needs of women. And so if you have women fund managers who have an appreciation of what women businesses need, you can actually be able to grow the businesses of women in the continent, and they can actually be able to finance the kind of trade that they need to take advantage of the AFCFTA.
It's really an excellent point about networks. That's critical for the access to finance issues, and it's across all countries where often these deals are made on golf courses or in other men's typical arenas in places where women aren't participating, and makes it very difficult. And creating those kinds of network, and as more women come up, that cooperation and that kind of funding will become, and networks for logistics and information, et cetera, will pass more, but you need a critical mass to some extent. Laura, let me turn to you, since you hear directly from exporters, and what kind of challenges do they point to, or questions do they raise about specific obstacles? But the other question is, the logistics sector is actually one that's been growing tremendously, hugely important, critical to global value chains, but I believe it's a sector that's still fairly male dominated. And I wonder how that's changing, and whether there are opportunities for women there as well. Over to you.
Fantastic, Caroline. And I just want to build on some of the great comments already made. I think when you want to address what problems exist, you need to really listen. And so in the work that UPS has done on women's economic empowerment, we've really been listening to the women entrepreneurs and the women small business owners, and to try to understand where they feel the most disadvantaged when it comes to participating in international trade, because we're trying to build the solutions to help address those challenges. And as I see it, there's 4 fundamental gaps that exist. And there's the gap in what women businesses produce and what can be exported. In some cases, they're in sectors that are not as inclined to export, particularly in the services provider side of the equation. And female entrepreneurs often run really small firms that have less access to productive resources and capital and networks, just like Stephen said, compared with similar businesses run by men. And so this means that female entrepreneurs are at a disadvantage in exploiting new trade-related opportunities. And we've already touched on it as well. There's a technology gap. Yes, women have the smartphones, but they have less access sometimes to the bigger range of technology capabilities, and oftentimes have less information on how to export. And so mobile technology gives them some tools, but they may need a PC or other technical resources to export or enter some of these global supply chains. And like I said in my opening remarks, women entrepreneurs are increasingly leveraging the internet to be able to expand their businesses across borders, especially now with a lot of these physical storefronts being closed with COVID-19 and social distancing. So there's progress there, but we need to bridge this information gap to ensure that it's being provided and delivered in the forums where women entrepreneurs and business owners are. And this is one, the next one that I see is that confidence gap. And I can honestly say I've been guilty of that throughout my career. It's the way, that women often look at risks and hesitancies often enters in terms of entering into export markets, because there's bigger risks when you export. And women always want to understand those risks before taking the leap. That's not to say that men don't, take those into account too, but we have this confidence gap that says, well, maybe I should think about it a little bit more. Maybe I need to analyze it anymore. But here's the upside. That confidence gap is temporary. Once women business owners export and they see the benefits and understand the possibilities, they're some of the most enthusiastic. And that's where women business organizations are so important. It's that network that we've talked about, so that women in trade can come together and see how others are succeeding and learning from each other. And the last is one of the most important that I see, and one that UPS is really trying to be a champion on, and where we had been working really closely with TO and Roberta Acevedo in particular, and those are the structural barriers that prevent women from trading. Too many countries have legal barriers that really limit women's rights to work and own assets. I mean, the fact that some women property in their own names, how do you run a business if you can't own the business itself? Women often have a harder time getting credit in so many countries precisely because of that. And so it automatically, gives advantage to the men. And so particularly for UPS in emerging markets, we're seeing women business owners as the most inquisitive and the most enthusiastic. And so if we can eliminate those structural barriers, once they make that first leap, they fly. So from that perspective, it's so important that we really eliminate those structural barriers. There's been some incredible analysis done that says at the current rate of change that we're seeing in terms of a lot of these legal barriers, it'd take 81 years to achieve gender parity in the workplace. I'm sorry. I mean, everybody needs to be thinking a little bit more like UPS in this regard and deliver more in a timely way. We really need to speed up the process of those reforms because those structural barriers continue to be an impediment. And that's where the WTO comes in. That's where a lot of the work that's underway that with respect to the Buenos Aires Joint Declaration on Women in Trade can be the foundation for really taking actionable work, but also where the World Bank can play such a powerful role in holding countries accountable to reforms. Because I think if we can advance those changes in terms of the structural barriers and hold countries accountable in terms of making the changes, the women are going to recognize the opportunities, stand on that foundation, and they're going to grow and fly. So in terms of the second question about the logistics space, you know, one of the first things I did when I joined UPS is I wanted to show, you know, that as a woman joining the organization, that give me the right training and I can do everything, you know, that's set before me. And so one of the first things I did was a little bit of that undercover boss where I drove for 2 months delivering packages as a UPS driver. I got the phenomenal training that UPS provides, so I know how to do it safely, efficiently, and following all the right processes and methods. And I think it was an important you know, test that I took in joining the company to show that women with the right training can do anything just like a man. And I think we're seeing that pivot in the logistics space. We now have over 150 women pilots, some of the most courageous women keeping the air network going through this pandemic. And we're seeing more and more women wanting to join our air fleet. Same on the ground when we're recognizing some of the flexibilities that need to be built into their workday as caregivers. More and more of them are coming into our workforce, and joined with the men, we've got an unstoppable team of people delivering. And so we need to keep showing that women can do anything, giving them the training, and then ending on the most important point, ending those structural barriers. There's still countries in the world that say women can't drive and or that women can't get the licenses to drive because, you know, we don't want women being truck drivers. Well, at UPS, we want every woman having an opportunity to be part of our company. So change the laws, licensing procedures, make it gender neutral, and watch what happens when women are given those opportunities. So back to you, Caroline.
If we were in an auditorium, there probably would have been some clapping behind some of these remarks. I wanted to highlight some of the work we're doing around women business in the law, which responds directly to these structural or some of the structural changes. So this is a report the World Bank puts out that basically classifies the opportunities women have in business relative to men. So if it's 75%, it means women have 75% of the opportunities as men, which I think is around the global average. And one of the areas is precisely this: what sectors can they work in? So are there sectors where they can't join? And trucking is often one. Even where they can join, for cultural reasons, it still tends to be male dominated. But there certainly shouldn't be barriers. And so what we've been doing is offering advisory around this, so helping countries to change some of those laws that have really become outdated with quite some success, and we'll continue working in that area. I'd like to turn to Rubana a little bit on this question that Stephen brought up about networks, and Laura built on as well, in terms of what she sees and what's happening in Bangladesh. What percent of the members of the BGMEA are women? Do you see new women's entrepreneurship or business networks or specific industry networks being developed? And is there more we can be doing in that area? Rubana, over to you.
Thanks, Caroline. currently, we have 1,955 members, and we have a little over 100 women members. So it's really low. In order to encourage female entrepreneurship in Bangladesh, especially in ready-made garments, where it's pretty much capital intensive, it's difficult for women to have access to that kind of capital. So if there were a way to adjust to the post-COVID challenges that we will have, in terms of more online businesses, in terms of more custom-made orders, so less in quantity, but perhaps more value added. So if we can have those kind of boutique manufacturing setup, and if we can scale that up, that would be of help to female entrepreneurs. Almost every second house in Bangladesh has a woman doing something or the other. And out of that, boutique or, just doing sewing regular shalwar kameez is also a vocation for them. It's a business for them. So, small businesses need to be scaled up to export level. We have great jamdanis and muslin and tats. I mean, these are all hand-woven fabric, which can be used for even Western audience or Western consumers. So if we can link those artisans to export mode, then there is a chance of really changing the dynamics of the current production. For us, we need at least 50,000 pieces of everything. Otherwise, it's just not feasible in our huge production facility. But if there is any way to do smaller batches, more value-added batches, and tell a better story, that would be worth it. Like in Paris last October, we tried doing a small show with jamdani jackets. It was beautiful. It looks beautiful on any woman who'll be able to wear them. So what about linking us to Bergdorf and not just, and with no offense meant to Walmart. I mean, great buyers, but what I'm trying to say is that this country can offer more value addition. These women entrepreneurs, if they can be linked to the export side, that would be a good linkage. So maybe more credit, more access to credit in no tariff barriers for women, and of course, if they can be once again tied to the export practices, and we'd be happy to do that. If we can do a small pilot, and if World Bank would want to initiate it, we would be all willing to do a few pilots and see where it takes us.
And we do some kind of pilots in that area in terms of both entrepreneurship programs specifically for women, as well as increasingly linkages programs of linking firms to export markets and things like that. So maybe that's an area we can consider for Bangladesh. We're coming to the end where I want to give you each a chance to make some closing remarks. I just want to highlight some of the things that have come up: the access to credit as an issue, human capital, especially around digital networks, the need for more female networks, and then these kind of linkages. Some of the questions that have been rolling in, we've addressed. But in particular, people are interested in more about what we can do in the area of informality and the many, many women who work in the informal sector. So in some sense, maybe that's a less traded area, although not in the case of these small scale traders, often in Africa and in some other countries. Digital and how that is likely to affect women, and to make sure that it remains inclusive in terms of digital divide and things like that. And then this other topic we've touched on, I wouldn't mind hearing more about, which is the confidence gap. One way I heard an economist once explain it, and this will be geared towards the economists here, is that men focus on the point estimate and women on the standard error. So anyway, so these are some areas you may want to touch on, but I want to give you each a chance to make some closing remarks, anything we haven't hit on. And I'm going to go in reverse order this time. So we'll start with Stephen. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline, and dear panelists and participants. So first of all, one of the things that I think I wanted to say by the time we finish this session is that we need to have women negotiators in the negotiating table. Sometimes it's very depressing if you go to a negotiating forum, you look at the composition of the delegations, and the proportion of women in those delegations is just very depressing. So I think one of the things that we need to do is to have women on the negotiating and in the negotiating table, because that's the only way we can actually be able to secure and ensure that the outcome agreement does actually take account of women empowerment and also equality and equity at the end of the day, based on what comes out of that trade agreement. So what is it that we are doing as ECA on this particular issue, on some of these issues? When it comes to the AFCFTA, we are working with governments, and one of the pillars we are insisting on in what we are calling the AFCFTA national strategies is a very strong pillar of trade and gender, just to ensure that governments know, as they open the economies to take advantage of the AFCFTA, they need to be aware that if they want the women businesses to grow and to benefit, then there has to be all those policies that they need to undertake to ensure that women benefit from the AFCFTA. So let's have women in the negotiating table. And when it comes to coming up with the strategies for implementing agreements, be it bilateral, be it multilateral, be it like the one we have in Africa, let's ensure that there is a strong pillar that focuses on trade and women and the youth. And for us here in Africa, I think we need to make sure that the e-commerce is brought forward, because that's the only way you can deal with the difficulties that informal cross-border traders are facing today, including having to carry money from across the borders. Thank you.
And great additional point about women negotiators, because if we don't have women at the table when decisions are made, making the laws, bringing issues that may be important to women, considering the products that may be important to women, either as consumers or producers, things won't change. Excellent. Thank you very much. Laura, over to you.
Yeah. So I want to pick up on that, because bottom line is change isn't going to happen unless there's broad and vocal support for it. And so from that perspective, yes, we need to have more women in the C-suite, more women in government, more women. But I want to levy a challenge. We need more he for she men. Some of the greatest champions and supporters in my career, and that I've seen in a lot of the women-owned businesses, have been men who've said, you can do this, and I'm going to be a champion to support your success. So I would levy the challenge. We can't wait to get women into all of these different important places of power, although we are accelerating those efforts. We need more men right there by our side, being he for she champions, and not being silent in terms of, you know, the benefits that come when we empower women for our communities, for our countries, and for, you know, the benefits that come to the world when the other half of the population is given the ability to have dignity, respect, and can contribute to, you know, the betterment of our global society. And so initiating improvements to the supply chain will only result if stakeholders of every single kind collectively press for action. And so this is especially important when it comes to applying the gender lens to trade. And I would say, unless women traders, particularly through associations and business groups, because I think there's power when there's unity of voices, we need to speak up about the issues that women uniquely face at the border so that these obstacles can be remedied. I'd say because of the work that UPS has been doing globally, able to share best practices for what helps facilitate inclusive trade and what hinders it. And I just want to give a shout out because to make change, you got to have it grounded in data. And so a lot of the insights that are provided in this Women in Trade report or the World Bank's Women, Business and Law report is so important for helping governments and those who have the power to make those structural changes that we've talked about have that fuller picture about how meaningful and ambitious the reforms have to be to support women. And companies like ours, we've got a stake in this because it's not just the right thing to do. It's great business sense. Having 50% of the women, in the economy on the sidelines because they can't engage fully isn't good for business. And so we have a stake in being a part of those efforts to reform and close those gaps. And we really want to be governments to be successful. And so I'll end with, we may be considered, United Parcel Service. We're United Problem Solvers. We're going to figure out ways to close this gap because it's good for our business, it's good for countries around the world, and it's good for the global community. Back to you, Caroline.
Thank you for the call out on data. I could not agree more, and bringing it together with the point that Stephen made about negotiators. I'd actually like to know the statistic on how many chief negotiators are women. So if anybody knows that, please send it in the chat. But something to look into. Excellent, and thanks for your support of our work as well. And finally, any last words, Rubana?
Sure, Caroline, thank you very much. Just wanted to share a couple of anecdotes with you. One is I lead a board of 35 very powerful manufacturers of Bangladesh, and out of that 35, only one is a woman, which is me. So I have 34 men in my board and only one woman. All I need is courage most of the time. When we talk about even our factory elections for workers, in workers' participatory committees or unions, trade union formations, rarely female vote even for themselves. So even if they are a contender, they don't vote for them. And often I've asked them, why don't you even vote for yourself? How can you not even have one single vote? And she'd say, well, I know I wouldn't be elected. So there you go. So the point is, if there's anything we need to teach women, it's only courage. Along with education, wherever we are placed, whatever we are leading, whoever we are talking to, whatever businesses that we are in, women just need to have more courage. Otherwise, no matter how much support we give them from anywhere, unless you have the courage to weather the storm that every woman faces, including you, me, and the workers in our factory, and even United Problem Solvers in UPS, it really doesn't matter. So I think along with education, the first skill set, of course, apart from negotiation as well, is just the awareness around the requirement of a critical element of just courage. Women just need to be brave, period.
Thank you. And there were these random control trials that looked at comparing teaching people specific business skills versus teaching them more of those kind of personal ways of interacting and presenting themselves and courage, basically. And I believe that that latter group actually did better in terms of future success. So maybe that's another area we can be doing more. I'd like to now turn the floor to Karen Brown, who is director of the World Bank's Gender Group, to give some closing remarks. She's been here and joining us for the whole conversation. I saw her nodding a lot, so I look forward to hearing what she has to say. Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. What a great conversation. So rich. So many things came out, and I love the panel and the presentation by Roberta and Nadia, and your great remarks, Caroline, in moderating. Just to give your last comment a bit of data, we did a random control trial in Togo on introducing personal initiative training to female entrepreneurs and male entrepreneurs. And the personal initiative training benefited female entrepreneurs so much more than men. 2 years after the intervention, women entrepreneurs had increased their profits by 40%, which was sustained compared to male entrepreneurs. So we know that we have to change our mindsets, as somebody said earlier, about what is both possible. And the personal initiative training, of course, addresses courage and confidence and other things. I want to pick up on 4 points for the takeaway going forward. The first is that I love the comments about networking and so forth. We're in an ecosystem here, and this ecosystem depends on so many partnerships, public, private, entrepreneurs, employers, workers, consumers. And I think as part of this ecosystem, strengthening our partnerships to take this agenda forward is absolutely critical. Webinars like this are a really important first step, but we need to strengthen our ecosystem with the data and the research and draw others in as we go forward. So first comment. The second comment is I was really struck by the examples that Roberto gave, and of course you, Robana, on the workforce and women as workers, not only in garments and services and retail. I think there's a few things that we need to focus on going forward. In the context of emergency, they need short-term cash. So this is where social protection comes in. We need to give them emergency lifelines, and many governments are doing this. And this is particularly important for the informal, self-employed, very micro. In the longer term, we need to invest in them for retooling, as Rubana said. I love the example of the university, but we need to think about this in the context of the workforce for the future, in terms of the jobs that we want to create that will be essential for building back forward. And I want to say that in that longer term, I think we haven't said too much about it. We need to figure out how trade adjustment assistance figures in to help that. And I think we need to pull out the lessons learned and do some research on trade adjustment assistance programs. My next point is about entrepreneurship. Recently, the IFC conducted a survey of 600 of their clients, and of course, the International Trade Center did this, of 600 female-led micro, small, and medium-sized businesses. And unfortunately, the news is not very good. And we also did an analysis of Facebook data on women and men business owners. And we're finding that women are closing their businesses in higher rates than our men. 1/3 of female entrepreneurs feel that increased care demands have reduced their ability to focus on their businesses. Firms are struggling to make the shift to digital. All of that says that we need to do more in a few areas. We need to, one, help give capital to these small firms to help them retool and diversify into new operations. We hear anecdotal examples of women-owned firms in garments making masks. Some of the fabrics are important for personal protective equipment. We need to figure out how we make the linkages with agriculture to keep those supply chains and food chains going for agricultural security. And in Africa in particular, women are a huge part of that agricultural value chain, both on the domestic production, but also in the export part of the sector. So we need to help companies make shifts. But in the longer term, we also need to provide other types of financial services that we didn't talk about, like insurance, which is hugely important and is a tradable service. And it's important for protection of assets. And women are not there in terms of the Finally, there's the digital divide, and we know that 300 million fewer women than men use mobile internet. And here we have to find a range of solutions to help make that shift, The first is to work with the private sector. We have collaborations with industry associations like GSMA, which are critical for phone ownership and getting phones to women themselves. But I think we need to actually harness the work that's happening that will be essential for trade in other sectors, like digitizing government-to-person payment platforms. Digital platforms in social protection or in wage payments can only help women in terms of helping them access and develop bank accounts. But the digital literacy piece, besides the access, is really critical for use. And some of you mentioned that the use of digital is not as great as it can be. And I think here, I love, Laura didn't give this example, but we're in a fantastic partnership with UPS in the MENA region through our Wi-Fi Women Entrepreneurs platform in terms of helping women transition to e-commerce platforms by helping them with overcome the logistics hurdles and other hurdles, not in the brick and mortar sector as well, in terms of their access to these platforms. And these kinds of partnerships are absolutely essential, but they need to be scaled. So we're doing it in MENA, but we need to do it in sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America and elsewhere. And Laura, we're going to look forward to working with you. And the final comment before closing is just to say that I really agree that we need to keep going. We need to invest in women. We need to bring them in every corner, nook and cranny that we're involved in, whether it's the negotiations, whether it's in the business side, whether it's in the government policy side. And I know once we do that, there is really great optimism, because when women keep going, economies, societies, families, and men all keep going. So thank you so much for what has been a delightful conversation, and we look forward to the partnership with all of you going forward. Back to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Karen, for those really insightful comments at the end. I'd like to also thank Mari Panestu and Roberto Acevedo for opening this session. I'd like to thank Roberta and Nadia for an excellent presentation and for putting all the data together and for all the hard work, along with the big team that's behind them, as well as our panel of experts that has really been fantastic. Rubana Huck, Laura Lane, and Stephen Karingy. Many, many thanks. And we look forward to continuing this conversation. And of course, Karen Ground for the closing remarks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.